Why does this keep happening to me? Is it coincidence? Bad timing? Just meeting the wrong people over and over again? Or is there something deeper at play? Because patterns like this don't repeat by accident. There's a moment most empaths experience, but almost no one talks about it clearly. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no dramatic event, no obvious warning, just a quiet realization. You look back at the people you've let into your life, and something starts to feel off. Different faces, different names, different beginnings, but somehow the same ending, the same emotional weight, the same confusion, the same slow exhaustion you couldn't explain at the time. And eventually a question forms in your mind. Not loud, but persistent. Most empaths spend years believing the problem is external. They tell themselves, I just attract the wrong people. I'm just unlucky in relationships. I just happen to meet emotionally unavailable or difficult individuals. And on the surface, that explanation feels reasonable. But it's incomplete, because randomness doesn't create consistency. And if the same type of emotional dynamic keeps showing up in your life, then something underneath it is predictable, not mystical, not spiritual in the vague sense people describe it, but psychological, structured, and once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. Let's start by clearing something up. When people talk about energy or aura, they often make it sound abstract, like something invisible, almost supernatural. But in reality, it's far more grounded than that. What people are actually responding to is information. Constant, subtle signals you're giving off, without even realizing it. The way you hold eye contact, the way you respond when someone shares something emotional, how quickly you soften your tone, how much space you give in conversation. Even your silence communicates something. And here's the part most people miss. Others are reading these signals instantly. Not consciously, not analytically, but instinctively. They don't think, this person is highly empathetic and emotionally open. They simply feel it, and then they respond to that feeling. Empaths tend to project a very specific kind of presence. It's not forced, it's not strategic, it's just natural. You come across as warm, understanding, emotionally safe. You don't immediately judge. You don't shut people down. You don't create pressure in conversations. And to the right kind of person, this feels like relief. It feels calming, grounding, like finally being around someone who gets it. But here's where things start to shift, because not everyone interprets that same signal the same way. To emotionally healthy people, your openness feels safe. But to the wrong kind of person, it feels like access, not connection. Access. Access to your attention, your patience, your emotional capacity. And that difference changes everything, because what you experience as empathy, they experience as availability. And not just availability, but unlimited availability. Here's something uncomfortable, but important. People often underestimate how perceptive, toxic, or emotionally unstable individuals can be. They're not always consciously manipulative, but they are highly responsive to patterns. They notice things quickly, who listens without interrupting, who avoids confrontation, who explains instead of setting limits, who stays even when things feel off. These aren't random observations, they're signals, indicators of how far a dynamic can be pushed, and this happens fast, often within the first few interactions. Now think about how empaths naturally behave. You listen deeply, you try to understand before reacting, you give people the benefit of the doubt. You don't immediately withdraw when something feels slightly uncomfortable. Instead, you lean in, you process, you stay. And in healthy relationships, those traits are incredibly valuable. But in unhealthy ones, they get interpreted very differently. Because openness without clear boundaries doesn't just look like kindness, it looks like flexibility. And flexibility over time starts to look like permission. Not permission you consciously give, but permission that gets assumed. This is where the dynamic begins. Quietly. There's no clear moment where things go wrong. Instead, something subtle starts forming between you and the other person. A pattern. At first, it feels like connection. They open up to you quickly. They trust you. They share things they don't usually tell others. And you feel chosen, seen, valued. But what's actually happening beneath the surface is something far more complex. Because for many people, attraction isn't always about connection. Sometimes, it's about regulation. They're not drawn to you because they want to understand you. They're drawn to you because of what you do for them emotionally. You stabilize them. You absorb their intensity. You make their internal chaos feel manageable. You become a place where they can offload without having to fully process themselves. And here's the part that makes this dynamic so powerful. You don't do this intentionally. You're not trying to fix them. You're just being who you naturally are. You listen. You hold space. You stay present. But over time, that creates a system. One where they release and you absorb. They fluctuate and you stabilize. They express and you process. And slowly, without either of you explicitly agreeing to it, roles get assigned. You become the one who understands, the one who stays calm, the one who holds everything together. And at first, it doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like purpose, because here's where the dynamic shifts from external to internal. For many empaths, something subtle begins forming over time, a connection between being needed and being valued, not consciously, but emotionally. When someone relies on you, you feel important. When someone opens up to you, you feel trusted. When someone needs your presence, you feel connected. And those feelings are powerful. They reinforce your role, but they also create a hidden trap, because the more your sense of worth becomes tied to being needed, the more your behavior starts aligning with situations where that need exists. And not all need is healthy. In fact, the strongest sense of being needed often comes from the most unstable environments, from people who are inconsistent, emotionally unpredictable, unregulated, because they need more. And here's the paradox. Stable, self-aware people don't need you in that way. They want you. They appreciate you. They respect your presence. But they don't depend on you to function emotionally. And because of that, they don't trigger the same internal response. So without realizing it, you may start feeling more drawn to people who activate that needed feeling. Not because you want chaos, but because it feels familiar, meaningful, almost like purpose. And this is how the pattern builds. You become the listener, the supporter, the stabilizer, again and again and again, until it stops feeling like something you do and starts feeling like who you are. But here's the problem. That role doesn't create balance. It creates imbalance disguised as connection. Because in these dynamics, you give more, you hold more, you process more, and the other person receives more. At first, the difference is small, barely noticeable, but over time, it grows. Until one day, something shifts inside you. Not dramatically, just quietly. You feel tired, not physically, emotionally. And the worst part is, you can't always explain why. Because on the surface, nothing looks wrong. There's no obvious conflict, no clear breaking point, just a slow, steady depletion. And instead of stepping back, you often do the opposite. You try harder, you give more, you explain more, you adjust more. Because somewhere inside there's still a belief. If I just understand better, if I just show up more, this will finally balance out. But it doesn't, because the imbalance was never caused by a lack of effort. It was built into the structure from the beginning. And that's the part most people never see. At some point, the pattern stops feeling confusing and starts feeling familiar. Not because you understand it fully yet, but because you've lived it enough times to recognize the shape of it. The beginning always feels different, but the middle and the ending, almost identical. And that's where something important happens. You stop asking, why are people like this? And a more uncomfortable question begins to surface. Why do I keep staying the same inside these situations? Because if you look closely, the pattern isn't just about who enters your life. It's about what happens after they do, how long you stay, how much you tolerate, how often you override your own discomfort to maintain the connection, and more importantly, what you don't do when something feels off. This is where boundaries enter the picture, and not in the way most people talk about them. Because for empaths, boundaries aren't usually a knowledge problem. You already know they matter. You've heard it before. Set limits. Protect your energy. Learn to say no. But knowing something intellectually and executing it emotionally are two completely different things. Because in real moments, when someone is in front of you, boundaries don't feel like structure. They feel like risk. Saying no doesn't feel neutral. It feels like rejection. Pulling back doesn't feel healthy. It feels like disconnection. Creating distance doesn't feel balanced. It feels like you're hurting someone. And that emotional interpretation is what keeps the pattern alive. Because instead of enforcing a clear limit, you hesitate. You soften it, delay it, sometimes completely avoid it. And in that hesitation, a message is sent. Not through words, through behavior. The message isn't about I'm kind. The message becomes I can be stretched. And people respond to that, not always consciously, but consistently, because human behavior adapts to what is allowed, not what is intended. So when boundaries aren't clearly enforced, something subtle begins to happen. Access increases, gradually, quietly, without any direct conversation about it. They start expecting quicker replies, longer conversations, more emotional availability, more understanding, more patience, more of you. And because you've already shown that you can stretch, they assume you will. This is the reinforcement loop, and it's one of the most important pieces to understand. Because patterns don't repeat just because they exist. They repeat because they work. Think about it from a purely behavioral level. If someone expresses inconsistency and is still met with understanding, that behavior gets reinforced. If someone crosses a line and is met with patience instead of consequence, that behavior gets reinforced. If someone gives less and still receives more, that imbalance gets reinforced. Not because they're consciously manipulating you, but because the system is producing results for them. And anything that produces results gets repeated. This is why focusing only on intention keeps empaths stuck, because you might think, they don't mean to do this. They're just going through something. They'll change if I support them enough. And maybe that's true. But behavior doesn't change based on intention alone. It changes based on feedback. And if the feedback never shifts, the behavior won't either. This is where exhaustion begins to take a different form. It's no longer just emotional. It becomes cognitive. You start overthinking everything, replaying conversations, analyzing tone, trying to figure out what went wrong, trying to fix something that was never balanced to begin with. And slowly, effort turns into maintenance. You're no longer building a connection. You're sustaining it, carrying it, holding it together. And that's the moment where something inside you begins to change. It's subtle at first. You don't react the same way. Things that you used to brush off start to linger. Conversations feel heavier. Silence feels different. You start noticing things you once ignored. Patterns, inconsistencies, emotional gaps. And here's the key shift. You stop feeling confused and start feeling tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that comes from holding too much for too long. This is the phase most people misunderstand. Because from the outside, nothing dramatic is happening. There's no big argument, no explosive ending. Everything looks normal, but internally, something is closing, quietly. You start pulling back, not intentionally, not as a strategy, but as a response. You speak less, explain less, react less, not because you don't care, but because you've reached a point where caring the same way costs too much. And this is where the dynamic breaks, not through confrontation, but through withdrawal. Because once your internal system recognizes that the pattern isn't changing, it stops investing in it. This is why empaths often leave without warning, not because they're impulsive, but because the decision wasn't made in a single moment. It was built slowly, through every ignored signal, every stretched boundary, every imbalance that was tolerated for too long. By the time they leave, they've already processed it internally, over and over again. And when they finally step away, it looks sudden. But for them, it feels overdue. Now here's where everything changes, because leaving the situation doesn't automatically break the pattern. It just ends the current version of it. If nothing shifts internally, the same dynamic will eventually reappear. Different person, same structure. So the real question isn't, how do I avoid people like this? It becomes, what am I allowing that makes this dynamic possible? And this is where awareness becomes power. Not surface-level awareness, but behavioral awareness. You start noticing things in real time. How quickly you over-explain. How often you say yes when you mean no. How uncomfortable silence makes you feel. How fast you move to fix something that isn't yours to fix. And instead of reacting automatically, you pause. That pause is everything, because it interrupts the pattern. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't immediately offer understanding. You don't overextend to maintain comfort. And at first, this feels unnatural, almost wrong, because for so long your instinct was to resolve discomfort quickly. Now you're doing the opposite. You're allowing it to exist. But here's what you start to realize. Discomfort isn't always a problem. Sometimes it's information. It shows you where a boundary is needed, where something feels off, where your energy is being pulled in a direction it shouldn't go. And instead of overriding that signal, you start respecting it. This is where your presence begins to change. Not dramatically, but noticeably. You become less available, not in a cold way, in a clear way. You stop giving automatic access. Your time, your attention, your emotional space become intentional. And here's what happens next. The same people who were once drawn to your openness start reacting differently. Some pull away because the dynamic no longer works for them. They can't access you the same way. They can't rely on the same patterns. Others try to test it. Push a little. See if the old version of you is still there. But this time, your response is different. You don't over-explain. You don't justify your boundaries. You don't shrink your limits to make them comfortable. And that's the moment the pattern breaks. Not because you became someone else, but because you stopped being available in the same way. This is the truth most people miss. Your empathy was never the problem. Your openness was never the flaw. Your ability to understand people deeply, that was never something you needed to lose. The issue was never what you are. It was what you allowed without filtering. Because empathy without boundaries absorbs everything. Every emotion, every inconsistency, every expectation. But empathy with awareness is selective, intentional, grounded. It doesn't disappear. It sharpens. You still understand people. You still connect deeply. You still feel what others feel. But now, there's a line that protects your energy, your time, your emotional capacity, and the moment that line becomes real, everything changes. You don't have to chase better people. You don't have to force different outcomes. Because when access changes, the entire dynamic reorganizes. The people who relied on your lack of boundaries fade out, and the ones who respect your presence stay. Not because you demanded it, but because your behavior required it. And that's where the pattern finally ends, not with a dramatic decision, not with a single realization, but with a series of small shifts that change how you show up and what you allow to stay. So if you've been feeling that quiet exhaustion, if you've been noticing the same patterns repeating, if something in this felt familiar, then this isn't something to ignore. It's something to observe. Because the moment you start paying attention to what you're signaling, to what you're allowing, to where you're overextending, is the moment the cycle begins to break. Not all at once, but steadily. And this time, for good.